Akedah Project.
We invite you to join.
One story, many angles.
Come learn with us.
We're going to be looking today at the Akedah story, the binding of Isaac, from a couple of perspectives. The first perspective is a more general one, and that is the fact that Abraham is tested. Now, the story begins in Genesis 22 by saying that after all of these things happen, and I'm going to come back to that in the next section, Vaha Elohim nisa et Abraham. Then it was then that God put Abraham to the test. Now, some people have suggested that test means, well, it's a way of alleviating the anxieties of the audience. You know, it's only a test. It's only a test. Don't worry, nothing bad's going to happen. However, that isn't really, I think, what it's about. The test is a real test. There was a very fine little monograph written on testing in the Bible and in rabbinic literature by Jacob Licht. It's only in Hebrew. I don't think it's been translated into English. And he makes the important point that a test is given by someone who doesn't know what's going to happen. And you have to just understand that the biblical God doesn't necessarily know everything in advance. There may be some texts where it seems like God does know everything in advance, but there are others where God doesn't know everything in advance. And the two tests of individuals that we know are the test of Abraham and the test of Job. All right, and these two tests are really the only two specimens of this genre or this kind of story that we have in the entire ancient Near East. There's nothing like the test of Job, which I won't go into now, anywhere else in the ancient Near East. And the closest thing you can get to the test of Job is the test of Abraham. Okay, so from my point of view, this is a test, and the test is to see how deeply devoted Abraham is to God. Right? Will he sacrifice the son that was promised to him, the son that he was told is going to bear his legacy? Right? Is Abraham going to be willing to sacrifice that because of his devotion to God? In other words, is his obedience to God greater than any reward that he might get from obeying God? In other words, if the reward goes out the window, will Abraham still obey God and do what he believes God wants from him? What I'm going to say now is that some people think, and there is, of course, a long tradition of this and some basis for it, that the story is meant to explain to the Israelites that even though there may be cultures in the world, in the ancient world, that the sacrifice of a child, that the Torah objects to that the Torah protests that. And I don't think that that's what it's about. And I'll tell you why. First of all, it's because it's about keeping Yitzchak or not keeping Yitzchak, right? That I think is the most important thing, which we'll see when we look at it in context. That's coming up very soon. And the other is that we have in a lot of ancient Eastern stories, and especially in biblical stories, what we call an etiology. That means that there's a reason given for the telling of the story, right? And there is a reason given for the telling of the story of the Akedah. It's to explain that the mountain on which Abraham binds Isaac, and in the end doesn't have to sacrifice him, is a mountain where God is seen, is revealed. And that's a site at which the Israelites, or followers of the Abrahamic tradition, are meant to sacrifice in the future. You'll see it very explicitly in chapter 22, verse 14. Vayikra Abraham Shema Makom Ahu Adonai Yireh Asher Ye'amer Hayom B'Har Adonai Yera'eh. And Abraham called the name of that place. That is the place where God sees. And in the context of the story of the Akedah, God sees is translated into God chooses, God selects, God selects. Right? And of course, what God selects is the animal in place of Yitzchak. But it also then goes on to say that's why it's said today that on the mountain of Adonai, it or he is seen, or he is worshipped. And I think that the reference is to the entire scene, S-C-E-N-E, sorry for the pun. That is, the entire event that happens there is a sacred event, and it's commemorated by making the site of that event a holy site forever. And of course, in the book of Chronicles, this site, Har HaMoriah, is identified with Yerushalayim, or the Temple Mount. Okay, now I'm going to go backwards a little bit and show you that in the preceding story, there's also an etiology, an explanation, and that comes at the end of chapter 21, where a covenant or treaty is made between Abraham and the Philistine king Abimelech. And after they make a treaty there, it says at the very end, almost at the end, verse 33, Vayita Eshel Diver Shava, and Abraham planted a God of eternity, El Olam, right? In other words, it's an etiology of the special site of Beersheba as a holy site. It's a place where it's appropriate to worship God. So we have these two stories in a row. Now I'd like to address the question of the context of our story, because the context, of course, gives a meaning in the same way that sometimes you can't understand a sentence unless you hear it in its context. You can't understand the story, from my perspective at least, unless you understand it in its literary context. Now, of course, the story of the Akedah becomes a paradigmatic story. It becomes a story of giving up, surrendering everything that is dear to you for the sake of a higher cause, right? There are many larger meanings of the Akedah that aren't necessarily tied to the context. But I think that before we go to those other meanings, which I believe you'll be hearing about in other presentations and other discussions in this project, I would like to discuss something of the context. Now, it's very popular to compare the story of the binding of Isaac to not the immediate story that precedes it, but two stories back. The story where Abraham is begged by his wife Sarah to throw his other son Ishmael, who is the son of Hagar, the handmaid, who's an Egyptian, Hagar HaMitzri, throw them out of the household because she doesn't like what Ishmael is doing with her son Isaac, who was promised to them. Okay, so this story is often in modern discussions, especially in Israel, called the Akedah of Ishmael, right? The binding of Ishmael, but he isn't bound, and there isn't any sacrifice in the works. It's just a story about how Ishmael is sent out of Abraham's household in order to become a great nation of his own. And of course, he is understood to be the ancestor of the Arabs. Now, there are a number of points of contact between the story of sending out Ishmael, the expulsion of Ishmael and Hagar, and the story of the Akedah. For example, in both cases, Abraham is said to get up early in the morning. In both cases, there is a sighting from afar. In both cases, there is an angel calling out from heaven. In the first case, the earlier case, the angel calls out to Hagar and says, lift up your eyes and you'll see there's a well right over there, and you'll be able to survive the difficult situation in the desert if you will just get your water from there. And of course, in the story of the binding of Isaac, an angel of God calls out to Abraham from heaven and says, "Please stop the sacrifice that you're about to perform. Right? I want you to spare this child and substitute for this child a ram that's caught in its thorns, and the ram happens to be on the site as well." So there are a number of parallels. Nevertheless, I will try to show you that there is, I think, a greater significance, or at least another great significance, to the immediate story that precedes, and that's a story about how Abraham makes a treaty with the Philistine king Avimelech. Now, Avimelech comes to Abraham and says, "I've heard about all these terrific things about you, and I want you to swear to me." Here I have to read the Hebrew. Hishava ali velohim heina im tishkor li ulemini ulenechdi kachesed asher asiti imcha tasa imadi v'yim haaretz asher garta ba. Okay, I want you to show a very healthy, favorable attitude, have a terrific relationship with me and with my land, because I am showing you a good relationship, and I want you to swear to it. And of course, the root for swearing in biblical Hebrew is shin bet ayin, shavah, and you say to swear using the nif'al lehishava, and that is what's being used here in chapter 21, verse 23 of Bereshit, of Genesis. And Abraham complains to Avimelech because his servants had been stealing his water, right, had taken a well of his. And so Avimelech apologizes, and the two of them make a covenant with each other, a berit, right? A berit. That's in verse 27. And then Abraham does something very peculiar, that very curious. He sets out 7 lambs by themselves. And Avimelech, of course, like a child at the Seder, asks, "So what are these 7 lambs?" And Abraham says, "Well, these 7 lambs, right, I want you to take as a witness to the fact that I am the one who has actually dug this well, and this well belongs to me and my people." Okay, and of course, Avimelech agrees, and the name of the place where the well was dug and where they make this treaty is Be'er Sheva, and Sheva, of course, is the word 7, and the word 7 was used, of course, for the lambs twice, right? And when you count up the root of 7, that is in the word for swearing, and in the 2 times that it refers to the 7 lambs, and the 3 times that it refers to the site of Beersheba, you get, of course, 7 mentions of 7, which could just be coincidence, but people like me wonder whether this is actually very deliberate. And there's an emphasis here on the 7. Okay, my point, though, is that a treaty is being made between Abraham and Avimelech, and the expectation is that Avimelech will obey this treaty just as Abraham will obey this treaty. Because when you make a covenant, when you make a pact, you keep your word, and that's the whole point. Well, God had made a word, had made an oath to Abraham that Abraham and Sarah would have a son. This part was kept, and that Yitzchak, the son, Isaac, would be in fact the one who would bear the name of Abraham and would be the person through whom Abraham's lineage, the crucial lineage in the relationship with God, would run. Right? The Hebrew lineage runs through Yitzchak, right? But if Abraham actually performs the command of offering up his son, then what happens to the promise? What happens to the oath? In other words, God's honor and God's integrity are put on the line by this story. Nevertheless, Abraham obeys. Okay, so to me, the contrast between these stories is the fact that Abraham is able to have a relationship of trust with another member of the Canaanite community of the times, with Avimelech of the Philistines. But it's not so clear that he can have that kind of trustful relationship with God. Once, of course, God calls off the sacrifice using an angel, an intermediary, which I think is significant. It's like a king sending his messenger to deliver an important message instead of doing it himself. In any case, the promise seems to be fulfilled. Okay, so the relationship between God and Abraham doesn't have to be rent asunder because of this event, although it's significant, as many modern commentaries especially have pointed out, that Abraham doesn't speak to God anymore, and Yitzchak doesn't speak to Abraham anymore after this event. This was a very cruel test, and the cruelty may be expressed in the fact that the relationship has undergone a sea change after this event. In any case, it's interesting that, of course, the site of Beersheba figures also in the Akedah, because although it doesn't say from where Abraham left to go to Har HaMoriah, the site of the binding of Isaac, it does say that at the end, Abraham and his two servants went back to Beersheba. It doesn't mention that Yitzchak went, which of course leads in the Middle Ages already to a number of midrashim that Yitzchak was actually sacrificed and then had to be revived. But I understand as Yitzchak not being in wholeheartedly together with his father at the end of the story, as he was when he went to the site of the Akedah. He trusted his father before, not clear how he can trust his father now. In any case, the next part of the story is, to me, the next important part of this context. It begins in a way that is almost word for word the beginning of the Akedah story. In Genesis 22, verse 20, after all these things happened, all of these things, which is the way that the story of the Akedah began, which I related to the immediately preceding story of the treaty between Abraham and Abimelech. So what happens in this little story? It's not much of a story. It's really a report. It's reported to Abraham, and we don't know by whom, but some messenger who comes from Abraham's brother, or who knows Abraham's brother Nahor, who is the ancestor of all the various Aramean tribes and factions. And he's told, to make it quick, that Nahor has had 12 sons. 12 sons. Now, 12 sons is the figure for national completion, which is why when the tribes are mentioned in any blessing, in Jacob's blessing at the end of Bereshit, Genesis, or in Moses' blessing toward the end of Deuteronomy, that you have 12. The Ishmaelites also have 12 among their tribal units. And so the idea is that there is a tribal or national completeness that is recorded for Nahor, the ancestor of the Arameans, right? And Nahor again is Abraham's brother. Now, what does this say about Yitzchak and Abraham? Abraham had two sons, which he came to only very, very late in life, way beyond the age at which parents can have children in our normal lives. And it was only by a thread that he was able to hang on to this one son, which says something about the line of the Hebrews, right? That it is precarious, right? That this thread could be cut, but we pray and we hope, right, that this thread is not cut, and that God's promise, even though it goes through only this narrow channel, will continue from generation to generation to generation. And of course, there's also a little bit of a connection to Yitzhak again in the story, because when it mentions one of the sons of Nahor, Bethuel, or Bethuel, as we say in English, right? But I like to say Bethuel. Bethuel, it mentions very specifically that he sired Rivka, Rebecca, and of course Rebecca is going to be the wife of Yitzhak. And it was very common in biblical times, in biblical society, and in some Semitic societies, even until today, for a man to marry his first cousin on his father's side, right? His father's brother's daughter marriage. Anthropologists see it also as mother's brother's daughter, but that's a mistake, because what happens after 2 generations is that the mother's brother's daughter is really father's brother's daughter, just 1 generation removed. Okay, I won't go into that right now. Okay, nevertheless, the idea is that this story shows that, by contrast, right, how precarious the lineage of Abraham is at this stage. And then, of course, we're going to get to a later stage, which is the stage of Israel being in Egypt, where they go down with only, it says Shivim Nefesh, right? There's 70 people, but it's hard to get the exact number 70. But in any case, a relatively good-sized clan, but not a whole nation. But they come out as a great nation. And so even through all of the travails and tribulations of being in Egypt, Israel grows. And it's very clear that in the same way that Israel grows to a large nation through the support and blessings of God, right, that Abraham and his family are able to grow through the blessings of God. And of course, it is no accident that in the Akedah story, after Abraham shows his great obedience to God, that God reiterates and refreshes a number of blessings to him.